as in Agenda 2030, there is indeed a commitment to significantly increase investment to close the gender gap and to close the resource gap. So this is again something that must be reflected in the G20 deliberations and in your policy pronouncements and in the way you carry out and implement. And then, of course, we have been very much listening to the message of the Turkish presidency and the theme of the Turkish presidency of the 3 I's. And this is very, very relevant to the gender equality agenda of inclusiveness, of course, and I would also add to inclusiveness inequality. There is, in the Agenda 2030, there is both a stand-alone goal on gender equality, and there is a goal on inequality. And as you know, gender inequality is the mother of all inequalities. So we need to address this issue of inclusiveness very centrally in the context of the inclusion of women. And as was said, half of humanity we are talking about. And yet this half of humanity is not reflected and represented and is not a leader in any part of the economy or the financial sectors. So we need, and in terms of investment. So we need to change that. And the tremendous potential has been recognized that it is, as was mentioned, it is in fact the greatest potential area, untapped potential area. People have been talking about, and we strongly support that. We are indeed talking about an emerging market of 1 billion women who could be, whose power could be harnessed if they are helped to realize their rights. Where are we now? I think everyone has talked about the gaps. Is the world economy, are the economies in the G20 countries really working for women? UN Women has done, has brought out its Women of the World Progress Report this year, and its key theme is transforming economies, realizing rights. And it looks at the conjunction between the economy, the economic system, women at work and women's rights at work, and their rights and the realization of rights. So both in terms of the intrinsic value of women's human rights being realized in the context of the economy, but also in terms of the economy itself benefiting, this report examines where we are. And it shows what has been already referred to. The gender pay gap, 24% global average, the gender income gap, the gender pension gap, the gender social protection gap, and labor force participation gap. So across the board, there is a huge gap, gender gap, and including, of course, the gender financing gap. And there, when we come to the entrepreneurship area, we keep emphasizing, of course, micro credits and also small enterprises. But really, we need to address and grow the middle. And why should women only be in the ghetto of the micro world of entrepreneurship? That's another area that G20 should really address, apart from addressing all these gaps that we have identified. Another area which we have highlighted in our report and which we would request you to take into account is that of unpaid care work. The SDG 5, which has been and which will be formally adopted, but which is now part of the package of 2030 agenda, has a specific target on recognizing the value of unpaid and domestic care work, unpaid care work and domestic work, and its redistribution, its provisioning. So this is a very big step. It's a transformative step because it is women's unpaid care work which holds them back, apart from everything else, from effectively and productively realizing their rights, right to education, right to work, but also prevents them from productively participating in the economy. So this is an area, again, we would request that the G20 address and take into account. And we also make a recommendation in our report that there should be a strong effort to create a quality paid care economy, which at once will address the issues of Youth 20, the Labor 20, create over, there are estimates that it could create 1 billion jobs. And at the same time, liberate women from the drudgery and burden and thraldom of care work, so unpaid care work. So this is something that we should look at very seriously as part of our W20 considerations. Financial inclusion has already been mentioned. This is something, again, in the Financing for Development Compact has been emphasized, that women's access to finance has to be grown in a way that has not been done in the past if we are to make the leap into realizing the SDGs in their entirety, but also particularly as part of women's economic empowerment and economic rights, which have been emphasized in SDG 5, and also with that, access to property rights, inheritance, land, all natural resources, and of course, productive assets, including finance. So this is something that we would strongly work with you to bring into the discourse, but also policy outcomes in the G20. And when we talk about the localization, this is what the discourse now is, that once this agenda is adopted in New York between 25th and 27th of September, the Transforming Our World 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has a huge and a very strong, centered, mission possible gender equality and women's empowerment compact, then we have to talk about how to localize it. It's a universal compact, unlike what was MDG or any of the previous agendas. So it applies to all countries, and G20 represents in its membership, in a way, the different typologies of countries in terms of stages of development, geographical areas. So it will be equally the task of G20 countries to lead the way in downloading and localizing SDG 5 and gender-sensitive targets and indicators in other key. There are 11 other SDGs where there are gender-sensitive targets. So we will need to work with you as UN Women to really localize and implement the I of implement, and also, of course, in I of investment in this agenda. One last word, or two last words. We would very much also like to engage and hope that the W20 will engage with the other engagement groups, because equally relevant, UN Women has a very strong youth strategy targeting young women and their empowerment, but also engaging young men in the gender equality universe. And I would very much like, of course, to count on all the champions, the men champions who are here, and particularly the Secretary General of OECD and the others as the he for she. As you know, we have a very strong he for she global movement of solidarity, of men standing up for women, men supporting gender equality and women's empowerment. And we hope that the G20 will embrace that campaign and take it forward. At the same time, the Prime Minister referred to how history is literally always interpreted and shaped in a way that it is very much a male-dominated, literally man-made history. But we are really on the verge of launching her story. And in that context, what we have now ahead of us, and I hope all G20 countries, heads of state and government will attend, is the first ever head of state and government meeting, global leaders meeting, to make commitments on gender equality and women's empowerment. This is the first ever in the history of the United Nations. It's the first ever in the history of humanity that the heads of state and government are coming together to make commitments on gender equality and women's empowerment. This is a Global Leaders Commitment Summit being co-hosted by one of the G20 countries, China, along with UN Women, and we already have 70 heads of state and government registered to come and make these commitments. So we do hope that all G20 countries, heads of state and government, will be part of that, and W20 should actively campaign to get their respective heads of state to be there, to commit to what we call Planet 50-50 by 2030. And that's the deadline, the expiry date for inequality, discrimination, violence against women, and to declare a planet, an economy, a financial system that is gender equal. Thank you.